WPA event group. And I am pleased to introduce Louise Buscus, who became an NTO in 2009 and became an ITO in 2014. And Louise has been to a lot of major events throughout the world and has a great deal of wealth, a great wealth of experience to pass on to us all. So Ben, can you just do a thumbs up if you are an NTO already? And Vinita, can you do the same?
I'm not a NTO.
Okay. Vinita, how about yourself?
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
Yes, are you an NTO currently?
No, I'm not.
Okay, so this will be new material for you.
Yeah, it's all.
And I see you've shut off your video, and Ben, you've shut off your video and your audio. And I'm going to do the same now so that Louise will have the floor to herself.
Thank you. And no, I don't have a great deal of wealth. And if I did, I'm not willing to share it. Okay, we are going to talk about jumps for World Para athletes. I always like to, yeah, okay, now let me hit the break page. Okay, perfect. I like cool pictures. And I always like useless little bits of information. So with 14 titles apiece, Canada's Chantal Petitclerc and Switzerland's France, yes, I can't say his last name, have won more Paralympic athletic gold medals than anyone else. So that's your little useless bit. And I just thought that was cool because it's Canadian. So quick review to talk about classification. So classification serves two purposes. Firstly, it determines who is eligible to compete in a World Path. Oh my gosh, it's going to be a long session. World Para Athletic competitions. So people may have some sort of impairment, but that doesn't mean that they would be eligible to compete in World Para. So that's the first thing, is to see, do they meet the qualifications established? And then once we've established if they're eligible, then it divides those eligible athletes into different classes, so that, you know, different impairments have different abilities, and therefore we're lumping them together so that they have shared, in theory, results would be close to the same based on their abilities or lack thereof. So these are all the classifications that there are, the different types. T meaning track, F meaning field, jumps is the anomaly, they call it a T, because there's running involved is the logic behind it. So that's all the classifications that there are. Luckily for jumps, we only have to deal with that many of them. So we're going to go through all of these to review what kind of variations that they would have from World Athletics rules, which we're mainly used to doing. I'm going to focus on mainly stuff that would be for the Canadian Championships or Canadian athletes. One of the biggest things to note about para athletes is they don't want to be treated differently than able-bodied athletes. They don't want to be treated better. They don't want to be treated worse. They just want to be, you know what? So we don't favor them because, like, oh my gosh, they only have one leg. You got to give them, be nice to them. No, these are the rules. They want them followed. They just want to be treated like everybody else. So we have ambulant jumpers. So what to watch for? You need to watch that they're using the proper jumping technique, same as you would for an able-bodied athlete. Are they jumping off of one leg on the high jump? For the long jump or triple jump, they can't do any somersaulting. They also need to have proper exit of the landing area. And they can't touch the high jump bar. Now, the exception to that would be some of the visually impaired, which we're going to talk about momentarily. So for the most part, for ambulant jumpers, it's very similar. The basics are similar. So let's talk about visually impaired, and so classification T11. 11 meaning one, the first one means that they're visually impaired, and the second one is the degree of impairment, and one being the worst. So these athletes they're blind. And so we want to make sure, again, we have an even playing field. So we want all of the athletes that are T11s, they have to wear eye patches. And they have to wear these eye patches, and it's just the same thing and we use medical eye patches. And they have to be taped on their eyes the whole time they're on field of play. The eye patches cannot be removed. They also, why, I don't know, can't explain the logic, but they also have to wear opaque glasses and an eye mask. They're not going to see out of those patches, but anyhow, they also need to be wearing the opaque glasses and the eye mask, maybe for extra protection. Those must be worn while they're competing. So the corollary of that is that if they want to take it off in between jumps, they can do that, but the patches have to stay on. So if you're working as a referee, you can check those eye patches all the time. If you and you can tell by the way they're holding their head, if you think that they're getting some light or something in there, then you can go check to make sure that those eye patches are sealed on there. So visually impaired classes T12 and 13, meaning they're not as impaired, they don't have to wear the eye patches or the opaque glasses. So it's only for the T11s you need to worry about that rule. So for assistants, the T11s, they're allowed 2 assistants when they're jumping. So one of them is at the pit and one of them is staying with the athlete. So the one that's with the athlete is there to orientate them, to make sure they're standing on the runway, pointed the right direction, ready to go. The one by the pit is there to give audio orientation so they know where to run. So when you're watching that assistant at the pit, it's going to look kind of scary because it's like the athlete's running right towards them. They might be talking, they might be clapping, they can do whatever works between the two of them. So they can stand anywhere that they want. And again, it's usually right on the runway. The only place they can't stand is in the powdered area, which we'll talk about a little bit more in detail in a second. So if you're the referee, or even if you're not, obviously you need that the competition area as quiet as possible because they're doing audio orientation. Usually at meets, we try to schedule these events when there's not a race on, that there's going to be a lot of cheering or stuff like that. You try to get it as quiet as possible. Or if it's not real quiet, you try to get the jumpers in between the noisiest parts. So the T12s, partially impaired, they are only allowed 1 assistant. And the T13s, which are, they can see, they just can't see well, they're not allowed to have any assistance. So the other thing, just one moment. we have a sliver emergency, but we're good. Assistants are not allowed to sit with the athletes. They are only there to assist with orientation. And don't kid yourself, a lot of the times those assistants are the coaches. So, and if you think, so when you think about it, usually it's a mixed competition. You're going to have 11s and 12s and 13s all out there at the same time. So it's not really fair to the 13s if they don't have any assistants out there and this other guy, so they've got their coach sitting right beside them, talking in their ear. No, so the assistants have to sit somewhere different than the athletes. You have to keep them separated. If there is infractions applied to the assistant and the athlete equally. So if the assistant breaks some rule, that applies to the athlete as well. There is a picture of them doing orientation. So you can see the guys at the back have orientated her already. She's lined up, ready to run, and he is standing there right behind the powdered area, you know, clapping, yelling at her. So the clock over here, oh no, over there. Come on. Anyhow, the clock is started once the athlete is orientated. And usually if it's a 11 athlete, that's very easy to figure out when that happens, because so when the assistant walks off the runway, obviously she's orientated. Again, I think you're going to be able to figure that out. So you start the clock. Now, if the athlete loses orientation, then the guide is going to, or sorry, the assistant's going to be yelling at them to stop so they don't hurt themselves. So at that time, you also stop the clock. Don't reset it, but you stop the clock. So we allow the athlete to reorientate themselves and to restart their trial, not get a new trial. They can just restart it. So you pause the clock. Once they're orientated again, then you restart it. So the other thing is the athlete must exit the pit on their own power. They can't, the assistant cannot give them assistance before they exit. I've heard Kathy Seller yelling at an athlete. So once they've landed, she's saying, okay, roll, right? Because it was an athlete who was just learning how to jump. And so she's saying roll, so they could figure out how to get out the pit on their own. So they can give them audio help, but they can't give them physical assistance to get out of the pit. For vertical jumps, the T11s, they're allowed to touch that bar, and that helps them orientate, right? So they've come up, they've touched the bar, they know where it is, and they start that before they do their run up, right? They might walk back, figure out how many steps. Obviously that little marker on the ground doesn't do them much good because they can't see it. Now, if by chance they dislodge that bar in the process of touching it and orientating themselves, it does not count as an attempt. We just put it back up and carry on as per usual. The partially impaired, the 12s and the 13s, they can put a visual aid on the bar. Anybody I've talked to has never seen it happen, but the rule is there that they can hang. It's usually would be a light sock or a flag or something on the bar that helps them see it. So obviously we don't use markers like this. You wouldn't use those on vertical jumps, but on horizontal jumps, you're not going to use a marker like that. It's a bit of a safety issue for these athletes. The biggest thing is you got partially sighted people walking around. They're very easily going to accidentally bump these markers. So we need to use tape for those athletes. So here's the fun stuff about horizontal jumps for visually impaired athletes. So they can't see where that takeoff board is, or they're having problems seeing where that takeoff board is. So we modified the rules so they have 1 meter that they can take off on. Same thing we do for our younger athletes with athlete development. So we give them an extra meter to take off on. We powder it so it's easy for the officials to figure out where they take off from. So then you can see in the cute little diagram, if I can get my cursor over there. Apparently I can't. So the first at the bottom, the first one is they've stepped over the powder. It's also right at the board. And so that's a foul. The one in the middle, that's where they've stepped. And so that's where we've measured from. It's a fair jump. And then the other one, if they take off before the powder, still a legal jump, but we measure from the back of the powder. We don't go further back than that 1 meter. So the other things to remember is you got to make sure that any extra equipment is not in the pit, from around the pit, that your pit rakers are being extra cautious about where they're putting their rakes. Officials need to be aware of these athletes and their movements, be ready to move out of their way if necessary. Another big tip is to remove the powder. It's easy to take some of the sand out of the pit, sprinkle it onto the powder, and then just sweep the whole works into the pit. Probably about the easiest way to get rid of it. Okay, so we got a video here. So there's a couple things that you can watch for. Is you can hear the assistant calling, orientating their athlete. And then also you don't have long to see it, but you can see the takeoff area, how it's chalked. And then you can also see how long that assistant stays on the runway.
Ahora.
And who can watch a video once? One more time, just so you can watch it.
Ahora.
The other thing that I just noticed there is they have the assistants and the athletes sitting together, so not quite proper. But gives you an idea how it works. So this is a interesting video. Lots of things happening in this video, so we'll watch it a couple times.
So let's go back to
the back, them helping
men's long jump,
orientate the next one coming out.
Lex Gillette. His 4th round jump. Well, that's got it.
Athletes struggling here with the noise from the crowd. That one looked like it might have hurt.
Yeah, that has to hurt that. You see he goes off the track. He comes back on the guide there in front. Certainly is a dangerous. He's hit the side. There, that has really hurt. He's got up and ran away, but that had to have hurt Lex Gillette.
Poor Lex there, just struggling.
Defending champion there, 2 fouls over his 3rd and 4th,
all
at
sorts of
6:34.
questions
He
to
does
mind
still
when you
lead.
watch that.
Does the American.
So, did he foul on this attempt? Did he on the run up, on the takeoff, on the landing? So watch it again and
So
just
let's go back to
is there anything wrong
men's
with
long jump,
those
T11.
different spots?
Lex Gillette.
There he is.
His 4th round jump. Well, that's got it.
Athletes struggling here with the noise from the crowd. That one looked like it might have hurt.
Yeah, that has to hurt that. You see he goes off the track. He comes back on the guide there in front. Certainly is a dangerous. He's hit the side. There, that has really hurt. He's got up and ran away, but that had to have hurt Lex Gillette.
So on the run up, no, he didn't do, there was no foul. They're allowed to run outside of the marked area on the run up. But did he foul on the takeoff area?
So let's go back.
Yes, he did. So yeah, you can go out of the area while you're running up, but when you go to take off, you have to be within the designated area. And did he foul on the landing? Yes, he did, because he never did land in the pit. Besides that, at that point, he probably didn't care that he fouled. It just hurt. So, amputees with prosthetics. Using their prosthetics on field events is optional. So, obviously, then hopping is allowed. Excuse me, snow mold season. Usually if I sneeze about 6 times, so bear with me. If the athlete chooses to use the prosthetic to compete, they must use it for all the trials. They can't, go back and forth between using it, not using it. So if they've chosen to compete with it, and if during the run-up it falls off, they cannot continue without that prosthetic. If they have time, they can stop and reattach it and then continue their attempt, but they can't do any attempt without it if they've chosen to compete. So that's something you're going to have to make notes to yourself if you can't remember what they're doing. So they're competing with it. If during the attempt, that prosthetic must clear the bar. If it doesn't clear the bar, then it's a fail, right? So if they lose it at the beginning, during the run up, it's got to be attached. But if whatever, he goes up in the air, it comes off in the air. If the prosthetic doesn't clear the bar, it's a fail. If it does, then it's a valid attempt. Same sort of concept on the long jumps or horizontal jumps. If it's lost during the attempt, it must land fair. If it lands outside the pit, it's a fail. And so whatever lands closest to the mark is where the mark is made. So if the prosthetic lands closer to the takeoff point, that's where you measure from. So that's all talking about visually impaired. We have all those other classes. So the other classes, the T20s, 35s, 38s, 42s, 47s, all the rules are the same. You just got to, the only thing is they may need assistance with placing their markers. And usually they come out with a piece of paper that it's been filled out ahead of time. And so the officials have to put the markers where they've requested them to be put. The rules state that the technical delegate can give permission for an assistant to come out just to set the markers for them. But honestly, I've never seen an assistant granted permission to come out there. So for everybody else, it's business as usual. Questions, comments? I can just hear Jerry. He's just wanting to make some comment.
Louise, there were a couple of things for me. The
Okay.
first is the width of the landing area is 3.5 versus 2.75. And why do you suppose that is?
Yeah, I think we just saw that.
Yeah, with Lex Gillette. And the second thing is, in Lex's case, they were all flat markers except 2 at the very back were raised markers or elevated markers. So it may be valuable to emphasize again that you don't use elevated markers.
The other thing that can happen is if you're at a pit that isn't regulation width, again, you're kind of playing with fire, but you put extra padding along the side just to help prevent what we saw happen.
For sure.
Right.
And of course, with the T11s, the markers don't make any difference because it's the assistant that's positioning them on the runway.
Right.
Exactly.
Ben, do you have any questions?
I appreciate being asked, but I don't have any questions really at this point in time. I know in terms of the jump, the one thing I thought of, because you said you had to have, or Louise said that you have to have the prosthetic on the entire time, but if on the takeoff, the prosthetic came off, would that then nullify the attempt? So I guess I do have a question.
So no, it doesn't nullify the attempt. On the run up, they have to have it on them. But if it falls off as they're jumping, it's totally a fair jump, depending on where that prosthetic lands. Again, if it falls outside of the pit, now you're talking horizontal jumps, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So if it lands outside of a pit, it's a fail. If that prosthetic lands in the pit, then it's a fair jump. The only thing that it changes is where do you measure from? But again, so the same rule applies as anybody else. Whatever is the closest mark in the sand, that's where you measure from.
And has anything ever happened where you believe an athlete would be doing that intentionally to try to have their prosthetic be dislodged so it would allow them to go further or something like that?
I don't think it would allow them to go further.
It's
yes,
pretty hard to do.
Yeah, they may have less weight in the process, but if they were ready for it to come off, they'd run a pretty big risk that it's going to fall off in the attempt, the run up.
Yeah, you may be thinking of it when they plant that 1 foot and go up, and then they kick and they throw that prosthesis out about 15 meters and try and mark that. I don't think that's ever happened.
No.
No, and I'm just trying to think of different scenarios.
Yeah.
But,
Oh, absolutely,
no.
because it all goes running through your head.
And if it was a like if there was any type of vertical jump and something came off, it's the same sort of thing. But the prosthetic, if it doesn't, make it over a bar or something like that, then I guess it wouldn't. The attempt wouldn't count.
Correct.
Now, it may also be important to note that there is only one VI athlete in Canada right now who competes in long jump, and he normally competes in Ontario, and he normally competes with able-bodied athletes, and he's a T12. So there are no T11 athletes in Canada right now that do long jump or
So
triple
basically
jump.
what David is saying is everything I just told you, you really don't need to know.
It's all good information.
It's amazing to watch these guys jump, though.
Yep.
It is.
Vanita, do you have any questions?
Well, thank you for asking, but no, not at this time. Maybe when I start to actually officiating there, then I might have some question.
Yeah, and
Okay.
anytime you have questions, feel free to email one of us. We'll gladly answer questions.
Sure, thank you.
Well, if there are no other questions, thank you very much, Louise, for your insightful presentation. I've heard it a couple of times now, and it gets better every time. Thank you.
No, you're such a